Hey, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. If it's 2 a.m., good morning, good evening. So I'm just going to walk you through the Neil Gaiman article. So I'm going to walk you through the assignment and then I'll actually read it out loud. If you want to read along with me, cool. I'll let you know when that's going to happen so you can just stop listening if you're not interested in that. So let's go ahead and get started. So here's what you're supposed to do. Why are we doing this? Adulting 101 is kind of like, what are the skills and habits we want to take into life beyond high school? And I will say with 100% certainty and authenticity that remembering how to read for fun, for edification, for, both fiction, nonfiction. So whether you're learning from something, so whether, maybe you're reading a psychology book or a self-help book or a tax book, like whatever it is, reading is so useful because it gives you access to some of the greatest, most brilliant minds on the planet that have ever existed. And then also, if you're reading nonfiction or if you're reading fiction, there's a really important place in our souls for stories. Like I'm reading this book right now, Parable of the Sower, and it's got stuff in here about climate change, about taking care of each other, about empathy. I mean, this is like, there's actually a character who has hyper empathy. But one of the things that's so important about reading fiction is that it gives us practice in stepping into the shoes of someone else. And that's empathy building. And that's a really important skill because it allows us to see from other people's perspectives. Sometimes people do stuff that either frustrates us or hurts our feelings or we don't understand. And it's so important for our messaging and for the way that we communicate to be able to step into someone else's shoes because it's going to change the way that we speak to them. And we need to understand where they're coming from. This is why things like in the current environment where you've got, people are trying to tone police other people. If you don't know what that is, go Google that real quick. Why is it people are dismissing certain messages about things like racism because they don't like the tone? Well, if you were just nicer about it, or really it's the audience's job to step into also the mind and the thoughts of the speaker sometimes. So it's a two-way street. And so that's one of the reasons that we read. Also, just because it's fun. I definitely revamped my belief in reading for fun during the pandemic because, oh man, I couldn't get away. So I went to Moscow in a book and I went to here. This was actually in California. Where else did I go? A couple other places. Anyways, so it's just sometimes a book that can be a little bit more absorbing sometimes than a TV show. And you kind of don't feel as bad about yourself when you've read for like 3 hours versus if you binge watched for 3 hours. No shame in your Netflix game, but just saying. So the first question I want you to answer is, what is your current relationship to reading for pleasure? Do you do it? Do you not? Is it like, Miss, I'm in the DP program or I'm a student? Like, are you crazy? Of course, I don't have time for that. Just what's your current relationship? Full disclosure, I took like a solid decade off, like between college and like, I would read for, school and I would read for learning, but I wouldn't necessarily, I stopped reading for fun for a couple of years, maybe not a decade, but a couple. And so you're going to read the article, Neil Gaiman. If you're not familiar with him, he's a fantastic writer. He has written some of my favorite books, both, fiction, one young adult book and another, I don't even know what you would call it, apocalyptic satire. It was hilarious. The book is called, he wrote it with another guy named Terry Pratchett. There's a Netflix series based on the book they wrote together called Good Omens. One of my favorite books ever. Hilarious, very sacrilegious. The demon and an angel team up to try and end or stop the end of the world. Hilarity ensues. A couple others. He also wrote American Gods, which is also a current Amazon thing. But, obviously, read the book and then go watch it. So identify any unfamiliar words. So as you're reading, did you stumble upon anything? Anything that stood out to you? Write them down here. And then what do you think of Gaiman's argument for why reading is important? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Or you can qualify where you both agree and disagree. You agree with some parts, but maybe you disagree with others. So you're going to kind of explain that. And I would like you to write at least a paragraph. That would be the dream. So now I'm actually just going to read this. So if you just want to read it to yourself and you're like, I don't want to listen to somebody else read it, go for it. But I'm going to read it. So here we go. You can also copy and paste this into a doc if you want to do some, some annotations, which I know you all love. But yeah, it's okay. So Neil Gaiman on why we read and what books do for the human experience. Truth is not in what happens, but in what it tells us about who we are. The question of why we read and what books actually do for us is as old as the written word itself, and as attractive. Galileo saw reading as a way of having superhuman powers. For Kafka, books were the axe for the frozen sea within us. Carl Sagan held them as proof that humans are capable of working magic. James Baldwin found in them a way to change one's destiny. For Polish Nobel laureate Wisława Szymborska, they stood as our ultimate frontier of freedom. But one of the finest, most dimensional inquiries into the significance of books and the role of reading in human life comes from Neil Gaiman in a beautiful piece titled Why Our Future Depends on Libraries, Reading and Daydreaming. Originally delivered as a lecture for the Reading Agency, an English charity devoted to giving kids from all backgrounds an equal chance at the good life by fostering an early love of reading, the speech was later included in The View from the Cheap Seats. The terrific compendium that gave us Gaiman on the power of cautionary questions. And this is the artist in residence right now. Gaiman considers how the act of reading changes us, what it's good for. Once in New York, I listened to a talk about the building of private prisons, a huge growth industry in America. The prison industry needs to plan its future growth. How many cells are they going to need? How many prisoners are there going to be 15 years from now? And they found they could predict it very easily using a pretty simple algorithm based about asking what percentage of 10 and 11-year-olds couldn't read, and certainly couldn't read for pleasure. Echoing Madeleine L'Engle's spirited 1983 lecture on creativity, censorship, and the duty of children's books, Gaiman considers how otherwise well-intentioned adults might thwart the seed of that life-enlarging and sometimes even life-saving passion for reading. In a passage of particular urgency for parents and educators, he writes, I don't think there is such a thing as a bad book for children. Every now and again, it becomes fashionable among some adults to point out a subset of children's books, a genre perhaps, or an author, and declare them bad books, books that children should be stopped from reading. I've seen it happen over and over. Enid Blyton was declared a bad author, so was R.L. Stine, so were dozens of others. Comics have been decried as fostering illiteracy. It's tosh, it's snobbery, and it's foolishness. There are no bad authors for children that children like and want to read and seek out because every child is different. They can find the stories they need to, and they bring themselves to stories. A hackneyed, worn out idea isn't hackneyed and worn out to someone encountering it for the first time. You don't discourage children from reading because you feel they are reading the wrong thing. Fiction you do not like is the gateway drug to other books you may prefer them to read. And not everyone has the same taste as you. Well-meaning adults can easily destroy a child's love of reading, stop them reading what they enjoy, or give them worthy but dull books that you like the 21st century equivalents of Victorian improving literature. You'll wind up with a generation convinced that reading is uncool and worse, unpleasant. Gaiman then turns the second key function of literature, its unparalleled ability to foster empathy. In a sentiment that recalls to mind Rebecca Solnit's inspired assertion that a book is a heart that beats in the chest of another, he writes, when you watch TV or see a film, you are looking at things happening to other people. Prose fiction is something you build up from 26 letters and a handful of punctuation marks, and you alone, using your imagination, create a world and people it and look out through other eyes. You get to feel things, visit places and worlds you would never otherwise know. You learn that everyone else out there is a me as well. You're being someone else, and when you return to your own world, you're going to be slightly changed. Empathy is a tool for building people into groups, for allowing us to function as more than self-obsessed individuals. In a sentiment reminiscent of Ursula K. Le Guin's electrifying case for how imaginative storytelling expands our scope of the possible, Gaiman points to a third essential function of fiction in human life. So argument number 3. Its ability to introduce us to different versions of the world by envisioning alternate possibilities for the way things are. Fiction can show you a different world. It can take you somewhere you've never been. Once you've visited other worlds like those who ate fairy fruit, you can never be entirely content with the world that you grew up in. And discontent is a good thing. People can modify and improve their worlds, leave them better, leave them different if they're discontented. But perhaps the surest way to foil a budding love of reading is to cut off access to books altogether. And there is no greater hedge against that hazard than the library, that sacred place. Thoreau once extolled as a glorious wilderness of books, when a library is open no matter its size or shape. Bill Moyers wrote in his foreword to a recent photographic love letter to libraries, democracy is open too. Gaiman recounts the formative role of the library in his own life. I was lucky. I had an excellent local library growing up. I had the kind of parents who could be persuaded to drop me off in the library on their way to work in my summer holidays, and the kind of librarians who did not mind a small, unaccompanied boy heading back into the children's library every morning and working his way through the card catalog, looking for books with ghosts or magic or rockets in them, looking for vampires or detectives or witches or wonders. And when I had finished reading the children's library, I began on the adult books. Gaiman was fortunate that the librarians tasked with nurturing his love of reading were the kind who inspired poems, and not the kind who tried to bar pioneering astronaut Ronald McNair from his childhood library. Ooh. With an affectionate eye to the librarians of his youth, Gaiman reflects, they were good librarians. They liked books, and they liked the books being read. They taught me how to order books from other libraries on interlibrary loans. They had no snobbery about anything I read. They just seemed to like that there was this wide-eyed little boy who loved to read. When they would talk to me about the books I was reading, they would find me other books in a series. They would help. They treated me as another reader, nothing less, nothing more, which meant they treated me with respect. I was not used to being treated with respect as an 8-year-old. Libraries are about freedom, freedom to read, freedom of ideas, freedom of communication. They are about education, which is not a process that finishes the day we leave school or university, about entertainment, about making safe spaces, and about access to information. Writing nearly a century after Hermann Hesse's magnificent manifesto for why books will never lose its magic, no matter how technology evolves, Gaiman borrows a perfect metaphor to substantiate his belief that books will endure in and perhaps past the age of screens. As Douglas Adams once pointed out to me over 20 years before the Kindle showed up, a physical book is like a shark. Sharks are old. There were sharks in the ocean before the dinosaurs. And the reason there are still sharks around is that sharks are better at being sharks than anything else. Physical books are tough, hard to destroy, bath resistant, solar operated, feel good in your hand. They are good at being books, and there will always be a place for them. But Gaiman takes care not to confuse the medium with the message. It is reading that counts, and its rewards are medium agnostic, he writes. We need libraries. We need books. We need literate citizens. I do not care. I do not believe it matters whether these books are paper or digital, whether you are reading on a scroll or scrolling on a screen. The content is the important thing. But a book is also the content, and that's important. Books are the way that we communicate with the dead, the way that we learn lessons from those who are no longer with us. That humanity has built on itself, progressed, made knowledge incremental, rather than something that has to be relearned over and over. There are tales that are older than most countries, tales that have long outlasted the cultures and the buildings in which they were first told. These tales have survived on the shoulders of people who have done their part to transmit them forward, something Gaiman examined in his excellent lecture on how stories last. He considers that it would take to uphold our own responsibilities to the future. As readers, as writers, as citizens, and as members of the storytelling species, I believe we have an obligation to read for pleasure, in private and in public places. If we read for pleasure, if others see us reading, then we learn. We exercise our imaginations. We show others that reading is a good thing. We have an obligation to support libraries, to use libraries, to encourage others to use libraries, to protest the closure of libraries. If you do not value libraries, and then you do not value information or culture or wisdom. You are silencing the voices of the past, and you are damaging the future. We have an obligation to read aloud to our children, to read them things they enjoy, to read to them stories we are already tired of, to do the voices, to make it interesting, and not to stop reading to them just because they learn to read themselves. We have an obligation to use reading aloud time as bonding time, as time when no phones are being checked, when the distractions of the world are put aside. We have an obligation to use the language, to push ourselves, to find out what words mean and how to deploy them, to communicate clearly, to say what we mean. We must not attempt to freeze language or to pretend it is a dead thing that must be revered, but we should use it as a living thing that flows, that borrows words, that allows meanings and pronunciations to change with time. We writers, and especially writers for children, but all writers, have an obligation to our readers. It's the obligation to write true things, especially important when we are creating tales of people who do not exist in places that never were. To understand that truth is not in what happens, but in what it tells us about who we are. Fiction is the lie that tells the truth, after all. We have an obligation not to bore our readers, but to make them need to turn the pages. One of the best cures for a reluctant reader, after all, is a tale they cannot stop themselves from reading. And while we must tell our readers true things and give them weapons and give them armor and pass on whatever wisdom we have gleaned from our short stay on this green world, we have an obligation not to preach, not to lecture, not to force pre-digested morals and messages down our readers' throats like adult birds feeding their babies pre-masticated maggots. And we have an obligation never, ever, under any circumstance, to write anything for children to read that we would not want to read ourselves. We have an obligation to understand and to acknowledge that as writers for children, we are doing important work. Because if we mess it up and write dull books that turn children away from reading and from books, we've lessened our own future and diminished theirs. Excuse me. Writing more than 2 centuries after William Blake's searing defense of the imagination, Gaiman points to the same supreme human faculty as our greatest obligation. We all, adults and children, writers and readers, have an obligation to daydream. We have an obligation to imagine. It is easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that we are in a world in which society is huge and the individual is less than nothing, an atom in a wall, a grain of rice in a rice field. But the truth is, individuals change their world over and over. Individuals can make the future, and they do it by imagining things that can be different. Just look around this room. Everything you can see, including the walls, was at some point imagined. Someone decided it might be easier to sit on a chair than on the ground and imagine the chair. Someone had to imagine a way that I could talk to you in London right now without us all getting rained on. This room and the things in it and all the things in this building, in this city, exist because over and over, people imagined things. They daydreamed, they pondered, they made things that didn't quite work. They described things that didn't yet exist to people who laughed at them. And then, in time, they succeeded. Political movements, personal movements, all begin with people imagining another way of existing. Gaiman's final obligation is of especially resonant relevance today. We have an obligation to tell our politicians what we want, to vote against politicians of whatever party who do not understand the value of reading and creating worthwhile citizens, who do not want to act to preserve and protect knowledge and encourage literacy. This is not a matter of party politics. This is a matter of common humanity. All right. So, your assignment. What did you think of it? Tell me what stood out to you. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Do you use your imagination? Do books help with that? So those are some of the things I want you to be thinking about as you're doing this assignment, because you're heading into adulthood. You're heading into university or careers. And regardless of, you know, whether or not what type of book you read, I really genuinely hope that you continue to read. So let's start now. I'll see you guys later. Bye.